Thank you very much, Sam, for meeting me today while you're over here in the UK.
Thank you for coming.
How did you come to realise that you were suffering from narcissistic personality disorder?
Well, it pains me to say that I'm a typical narcissist. I grew up in an abusive environment. Physical abuse, psychological abuse, verbal abuse. This is usually the template upon which narcissism grows and from which it emanates. I spent my life denying that anything's wrong with me. I went through life oblivious to the harm I was doing to myself and to others, until I've hit rock bottom. And I've hit rock bottom 3 times in my life, and every time I hit rock bottom, I was diagnosed by a qualified mental health practitioner as a narcissist, someone with a narcissistic personality disorder. It didn't sink home the first time, it didn't strike home the second time, but the third time I said to myself, I have to find out what this thing is. It's cancerous, it's malignant, I keep losing everything I have, starting with loved ones or people I believed I loved, and ending with property and finances. So everything was crumbling around my ears, time and again.
Is that what you mean by the rock bottoms, that you'd lose
rock bottom means that
everything?
I was left penniless, loveless. I've been abandoned. My wife divorced me on the second occasion. I lost my reputation. I was unable to function in my profession, and so on and so forth. So this happened once, and then twice, and then thrice. And each and every time, the narcissistic personality disorder kept cropping up, kept popping up. And I said to myself, I've got to find out what this is. The second time I've been diagnosed in jail. I did time for financial fraud, securities fraud. And I was forcibly, it was part of my probation conditions. So I forcibly attended a series of diagnostic tests and then quasi or pseudo therapy. And again, narcissistic personality disorder cropped up. So I said, I have to find out what this is. And I began to search for information. I was flabbergasted to discover that there was nothing on the topic, literally nothing. The diagnosis, narcissistic personality disorder, was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1980. That's
Quite recent.
Quite recent in scholarly terms. There have been 2 books on the subject. One of them, a popular colloquial discourse by Alexander Lowen, and another one written in 1974, totally inaccessible, arcane language. No one understood anything. Hopefully the author did, because presumably no one else did. And the guy was Kohut. He was a very famous psychologist, and so on. And then there were people like Scott Peck, who conflated narcissism with evil and God and right and wrong and other metaphysical nonsense. So there was no help there. There was nothing there. I had literally to invent the language with which I could describe my own experiences. At the time, I didn't have any aspirations as an authority on the subject. I just wanted to understand myself.
Yeah.
So I kept observing myself, introspection, and I had to invent the language with which I could describe my inner processes, my inner dynamics. This language later became widely accepted, and today it's part of the scholarly discourse. But at the time, I had to invent it. And then I went on the internet, and internet was at its inception. It was a very new phenomenon. I started to look for like-minded, sufferers, and no one would come forth. But many victims came out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
Family members, spouses, children, neighbors, colleagues, parishioners, you name it. Thousands upon thousands. Within less than a year, I had 20,000 members.
Oh my goodness.
And in the internet at that time, we're talking 1997, there was no internet. And yet there were 20,000 members. And within 4 years, there were 60,000 members. And within 4 years, there were numerous other groups, which put together would possibly amount to 1 million members, To this very day, there are dozens of groups which cater exclusively to victims of narcissists. Gradually and very, very slowly, people began to admit that they have been diagnosed with narcissism, so I had access to other narcissists, and I began to call up their experiences and put everything together and try to systematize. Then I started to correspond with therapists, and then with social workers, and then with, the authorities, and so on and so forth. 16 years later, I have this humongous database of everything I believe there is to know about the disorder. Thus, the bulk of it, not reflecting my own experiences, but extracted from other people's.
Mm-hmm.
And it became gradually clear, to me at least, that narcissism is not merely a mental health phenomenon, that it has pronounced cultural and societal and social dimensions, that narcissism is an affliction that pertains to individuals as well as societies and cultures, that narcissists tend to gravitate to certain professions where they can garner narcissistic supply, attention, adulation, admiration, sense of power, being feared. So narcissists and psychopaths are overrepresented in professions such as politics, the clergy, show business, the media, no offense, and so on. So we were now talking about job characteristics, whole careers, entire professions.
Mm-hmm.
So narcissism started as one person's quest, and then an individual personality disturbance or character disturbance. But now I think it's a much wider thing, much wider thing. Moreover, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, narcissistic personality disorder has been conflated with or coalesced with other mental health disorders, mainly personality disorders such as antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, but also certain mood disorders and so on. So now narcissism is integrated and is an integral part of other mental health disorders. For instance, bipolar disorder has a pronounced, a very clear manic phase, where there are very strong narcissistic manifestations. Asperger's or other autism spectrum disorders, they have problems with empathy. They have problems with communication. So it's also narcissistic. Borderline is usually comorbid, co-diagnosed with narcissism.
Would you say that there's a spectrum of narcissism? Like at one end you have someone who has full-on narcissistic personality disorder, and then along a continuum there are people with varying degrees of narcissistic traits?
Narcissism is a spectrum. At the one end of the spectrum, we have healthy narcissism, which is the foundation of self-esteem, self-confidence, a sense of self-worth, knowledge of one's limitations and shortcomings on the one hand, and abilities and skills and talents on the other. So without narcissism, we would be, shrinking violets, would be socially anxious and shy and so on, won't be able to function. Healthy narcissism is essential. And then there's a whole spectrum. Healthy narcissism, certain narcissistic traits, personality style, behaviors, and so on. At the extreme end, we have malignant narcissists. And usually they're also psychopathic. So we have psychopathic narcissists. That's these people, and that's a small minority. I wouldn't say negligible, but small minority of people. These people tend to lack empathy. They are unethical, to the point of being criminal. They're exploitative, they're abusive, etc., etc. So yes, it's an entire spectrum. Moreover, it depends on the social and cultural context within which one operates. So if you have cultures and societies which encourage narcissistic traits and behavior and reward them, naturally this would tend to render people more narcissistic. So take for instance Western culture, or more specifically American culture, or Anglo-Saxon culture, where ambition is rewarded. Certain types of unethical behaviors are not frowned upon, or even encouraged. Empathy is limited by choice and by design, and so on. So these societies inevitably would tend to single out and encourage narcissists, and then people would tend to emulate them and become more and more narcissistic. In other societies, such as Japan, for instance, and so on, there is collective narcissism, but not individual narcissism. So people would channel their narcissism through the collective. They would be proud to belong to
And to be the
a winning
best
team.
of the best country coming up with
Right,
the
the
newest
best of
inventions.
via the collective.
Mm-hmm.
So we have collective narcissism. Narcissism is inevitable. It's everywhere. Everyone is, to this or that extent, a narcissist. The test is the question of harm, the question of ethics, and the question of empathy, above all, question of empathy. Are you able to empathize despite the fact that you seek self-gratification, despite the fact that you are in need of narcissistic supply? Are you ruthless? Are you relentless? Do you trample over people? Do you abuse? Do you exploit? Can you sympathize with other people's needs, priorities, emotions, fears, and so on? If the answer is, I can't, I have no empathy, then you are a malignant narcissist. All narcissists treat other people as objects.
Right.
But not all people who treat other people as objects are narcissists.
Right.
So we have, for instance, sexual sadists.
Mm-hmm.
Sexual sadists derive an intense sense of pleasure from inflicting pain.
Mm.
And this has nothing to do with narcissism.
Right.
You do have narcissists who are serial killers, and they derive an intense sense of pleasure from their omnipotence, from their unlimited power over the subject of torture or subject of killing. So it all depends. You need to trace the psychodynamics of each and every case. Not two serial killers are alike, for instance.
And to find that out, would you always look back into somebody's childhood? Because from what I know, narcissism is not something that anybody is born with. It's something that is developed, and I probably don't know the whole thing, but from what I understand, it can be a child who is so severely abused, whether that's through neglect or sexual abuse or physical abuse, that they can't deal with that, and actually it's like their soul goes and they are just a shell. And then there is the other side, which I actually only learnt recently from watching your videos online, that somebody can become a narcissist because their parents have actually built them up too much.
There are two types of narcissists: those who hark back or are the outcome of severe abuse, and those who are put on a pedestal and admired and idolized by their parents and can do no wrong, and so on and so forth. But this distinction is an optical illusion, because both types of children are treated as objects. Whether the child is put on a pedestal or the pedestal is put on the child as a form of abuse, in both cases the child is treated as an object. When the child is abused, the child is being objectified. And when the child is admired and idolized, the child is being objectified as well. The child becomes the receptacle of the parents' dreams and expectations. The child is put under enormous pressure to fulfill the parents' aspirations and wishes and hopes. In other words, the child becomes an extension of the parent, becomes the long arm of the parent. In the other case, where the child is severely abused and harshly molested or whatever, in that case, the parent does not see the child at all. The child becomes again a receptacle, but this time of the parent's rage, of the parent's inadequacies, frustrations, aggression, and so on. In both cases, the child is perceived as an inert container for the parent's psyche or psychology.
Not as an individual person.
Not as an individual at all. Actually, these parents do not allow the children, abused children, to develop boundaries, a sense of personal autonomy, a sense of personal worth, a sense of their own future, and they don't allow them to develop their own path. They usually micromanage the child. They usually impose on the child. They isolate the child socially and otherwise. They regard everyone else who might enter the child's life as competition. So much later in life, the child is not allowed to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And if they do, then the mother or the father try to denigrate the future spouse. And then when they have children, etc., etc. So there's always a state of ownership, of domination by the parent. And it is not really very important in which way you abuse the child, by idolizing the child or by trampling on the child. So this distinction is not very important. Parents with mental health issues, including bipolar and definitely borderline, their children have a much higher chance of developing narcissism. Narcissism is a defense mechanism. It's a coping strategy. its main role in early childhood is to fend off pain, to fend off hurt. The child creates something called the false self. The false self is everything the child is not and wished that he were. So the false self is omnipotent, all-powerful. False self is omniscient, knows everything. And above everything, the false self is invulnerable, impermeable, not prone and not able to experience pain. So it's like that. It is the false self that interacts with the offending parent, with the hurtful parent, with the parent that inflicts pain. But because the false self is incapable of experiencing pain, the child is protected. Yeah. The true self is behind this shell. It's like a castle and a moat.
So there is a true self underneath that?
There is a true self underneath. Now, of course, the longer one uses it's a use it or lose it situation. The longer one uses the false self to interact with the world, the less capable the true self becomes, the more dilapidated, the more depleted, the more atrophied. Finally, it's dead. So we are left only, narcissists like me, are left only with the false self. But the false self is a concoction. It's a piece of fiction. It's a narrative. It's a story that I have told myself when I've been abused and so on and so forth in order to fend off, to put a wall between me and the pain.
And how do you know there's no real you left inside? How do you really know that? How do you feel it? Or
because there isn't a single thing I do and a single thing I feel that cannot be directly and exclusively traced to the false self. There is nothing there. I don't need the added assumption of a true self to fully explain myself. It's like God, in science. Scientists say, I don't need God to explain the world. No one knows why abused children react so differently to the same set of circumstances, same set of parents, and same treatment. Some of them become narcissists, others develop borderline personality disorder, then there's, a very tiny minority develop multiple or dissociative identity disorder, and so on and so forth. And no one really knows why. There are the most evident speculation, would be genetics. So the propensity or the predilection to react in a certain way might be embedded in one's specific genes. But that's a very highly unsatisfactory explanation. My personal belief is that it's simply a winning coping strategy. An abused child tries everything to sway the parents to love him, to try to restore sanity into essentially an irrational, erratic, unpredictable, capricious, volatile, dangerous situation. And so he tries, narcissism. He tries to emulate the abusers by becoming unpredictable, volatile, suicidal, and that would be the borderline solution. He tries everything. Now, with certain children, certain solutions would work. The parents are never the same. They are younger with one child, older with the other. They've gone through their own life experiences. They've evolved or devolved, and so on and so forth. So I would tend to think that children adopt mental health disorders as both shields and adaptive strategies in accordance with what works. And what works changes in time and with the children.
Yeah, and as the abuse changes as
well. And as the abuse everything changes. Yeah. It's not a static situation. Yeah. Parents who are, for instance, psychopaths or sadists would tend to perfect the abuse. They would render it more subtle, more stealthy, and ambient abuse. Some of them would discover that they can use other people to abuse. So there is abuse by proxy. They enlist and recruit other people to do their bidding. Others would grow old and will ameliorate, and their psychopathic and narcissistic qualities will disappear gradually. So the last child will not have been abused, while the first two have been abused, etc., etc. So this is not a static situation, it's a river, and one can never enter the same river twice. So one can never have the same solution to abuse.
Do you think somebody with narcissistic personality disorder or borderline like myself, do you think we can ever be happy, truly happy?
Oh, narcissists mostly are happy. They're happy because they're happy-go-lucky. They cruise through life and through the world, they're wreaking enormous damage. They're akin to hurricanes. They wreak damage in their wake and so on, but they're always energetic. They always swirl around. They're always, they're very happy, most of them. Borderlines are not.
Yes, I'm not.
Borderline is something completely different. Borderline is premised on unhappiness. The main dynamic of borderline is the sadness, the enormous reservoir of sadness which one acquired in early life and which one is desperately trying to get rid of or to transform into other energies and emotions, and that is a Herculean, probably impossible task. I've been claiming for a long time now that narcissism, borderline, other cluster B personality disorders are actually private cases of dissociative identity disorder. They're private cases of multiple personality.
Right. Yeah.
I think people with, for instance, borderline and narcissistic traits actually have two personalities. One is the protector. The protector is the narcissist. The role of the narcissist is to make sure that the crazy borderline will not kill the organism, will not kill both of them. It's very common in multiple personality where there is one personality which protects all the others. Usually that personality also communicates with the outside. And so this would be my explanation for this combination. Don't forget also that I don't need to tell you that the predominant psychodynamics of borderline is abandonment anxiety. There's enormous fear of abandonment anxiety. Now, one way of avoiding abandonment anxiety is by saying, I'm impervious to abandonment, I don't care about abandonment. I will never be abandoned because I'm perfect, I'm brilliant, I'm omnipotent, and who would want to abandon someone like me? I mean, it's inconceivable that I should be abandoned, and so on. So the narcissist also tries to change, the narcissist in a borderline also tries to change the abandonment anxiety dynamic, and therefore the attachment style, the way the borderline bonds. These type of borderlines would sometimes bond with other people as borderlines, and then they would experience huge abandonment anxiety. They would be constantly afraid to be dumped. Mm-hmm. They would become codependents. They would be clinging and needy and volatile and erratic and I don't know what. And finally, they will develop suicidal ideation and will attempt suicide. And many of them choose to bond as narcissists, because when they bond as narcissists, all these risks don't exist. Narcissist is a protective Teflon layer between them and life, them and actual abandonment, them and pain.
So really, people like myself with borderline, like yourself with narcissistic personality disorder, and people with dissociative identity disorder, we're kind of really all the same in that we weren't able just to stay ourselves through our childhoods, and we needed to create another self, at least one other self.
Well, that's not a new concept. People like Kernberg in the 80s and many other scholars suggested that the personalities of narcissists and borderlines and so on are what we call disorganized. They are chaotic. I prefer to use the term fragmented. They are fragmented. Each fragment of an otherwise what should have been normal personality, each fragment attains its own personality-like traits and characteristics and functions pretty autonomously. Now, we have this galaxy of shredded personality, with this galaxy of shreds of personality. Shrapnel, it's like a bomb exploded and we have these shrapnels. And each element interacts with the environment and with other people in a different way. Each element develops gradually a function which reflects its strengths and capacities and so on. In the case of borderline narcissist, the narcissist, as I said, protects the borderline. The borderline bonds where the narcissist cannot. So the borderline makes the initial contact and experiences the emotions. But once the emotions are clear and strong, the narcissist takes over in order to fend off the hurt and inevitable pain, and so on. These are very complex dynamics of personalities which were shattered by experiences which the child at the time deemed unsustainable, and the child could not cope with these experiences.
I'm really grateful that you gave me your book, and I'm so looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
Just before, I might find some answers for myself in there, just for anybody else, whether they have narcissistic personality disorder solely, or they have the traits as part of borderline, or what can they do?
Of course, therapists are self-interested. They are selling a product and a service. So they're bound to tell you that the product and service will be helpful and useful and so on. It will not be. There is no way to cure or heal or glue together this fragmented, shrapnelled personality. The blows in early childhood and early adolescence have been so massive that the cracks are unfixable. The edifice has crumbled. There's no way of putting it back. It's Humpty Dumpty. What can be done, to some extent, is behavior modification. Counterproductive, self-defeating, self-destructive, and socially unacceptable or antisocial behaviors can be identified, and techniques and strategies can be learned on how to modify these, how to alter them in a way which would render them partly socially acceptable, and definitely not self-defeating and self-destructive. With regards to other aspects, there's medication. So, for instance, depression can be treated with medication. Obsessive-compulsive disorders can be treated with medication. So if you put together medication and very modest goals for therapy, when modifying 1, 2, or 3, or 5 behaviors, which have proven over the course of your life to have damaged you, if you put these two realistic goals together, you might end up being marginally better off than you are. No one can fix who you are. A personality disorder is a disorder of your entirety. It's a disorder of all of you. It permeates every single cell of your being, of your psychology, your psychodynamic. There is no way to change all of you. There are ways to change some behaviors and some traits, but never all of you.